It seems like every time you log on to YouTube and search Osmo Pocket, you see this person or that person talking about, reviewing, or even selling neutral density or ND filters. But rarely do you get a good discussion and presentation on the science behind ND filters and why they're important to you as a photographer or videographer. Well, on this episode of Picks to Flicks, we're going to do just this, and we'll also review the Freewell All Day set of ND filters for the Osmo Pocket. Most of the time, when we think about photographic filters, the first thing that comes to mind is adding a piece of specialized glass to improve or condition the light entering our lens. Think about a polarizing filter that reduces glare or increases contrast, or a UV haze filter that decreases ultraviolet light and haze. A neutral density or ND filter is a little different. Rather than conditioning the light the camera is seeing, its main job is to reduce the intensity of the light. Well, that doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, we spend a lot of money on lenses with large apertures to gather more light for our digital sensor to use, making photos and videos, and buy expensive cameras with very sophisticated sensors and processors to improve the performance of our camera in low light. Why in the name of Pete would we want to put something in front of our camera to reduce the amount of light coming in? In order to answer this question, let's quickly take a look at something called the exposure triangle. I'll be putting together a much more in-depth look at exposure for stills and video in a later episode of Picks to Flicks. Be sure to subscribe to be notified. In the words of MC Hammer, ring the bell, school's in session. First, let's define exposure value, or EV. The EV is a number that is a combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. This means if you change one of the corners of the triangle, you need to change another corner, otherwise the EV is going to change. For example, if you decrease your shutter speed from 1/250th of a second to 1/125th of a second, you are letting in twice as much light onto your sensor. So you're going to need to reduce your ISO by half, or reduce the size of your aperture by half. Hold on. We're using terms we haven't defined yet. Okay, so at the top of the triangle, you've got something called aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening from the lens to the camera. In the case of Osmo Pocket, the aperture is fixed at f2.0. That's a pretty large aperture, meaning the lens is going to let a lot of light into your Osmo Pocket, and it can't be reduced or stopped down ever. FYI, the smaller the f number, the larger the aperture is, as you can see in my animation here. A large aperture, also known as a fast lens, is normally a good thing since it allows you to shoot at much lower ambient light levels without having to turn up the ISO or reduce the shutter speed too far. However, like many things in life, too much light can sometimes be too much of a good thing. Now let's discuss shutter speed. The shutter speed is how long the shutter remains open to allow light to pass through the aperture, hitting the sensor to expose your image or video frame. The shutter speed is not the same thing as FPS, which is also called frame rate. I see these two terms incorrectly used interchangeably all the time. The frame rate is how many frames of video are taken every second. Movie frame rates are generally 24 frames per second, TV is around 30 frames per second, and special effects like slow motion can be even higher. For example, the Osmo Pocket can shoot up to 120 frames per second. In this animation, the frame rate is 5 frames per second, so each frame lasts 1/5 of a second, but the shutter speed is 1/50th of a second. Make sense? Anywho, shutter speed controls how much the movement of the subject is stopped or frozen. The faster the shutter speed, the more motion is stopped. For a sports photo, this is often a good thing, like in this shot of Cubs infielder Javi Baez hitting a home run at Wrigley Field I took last year. The shutter speed on this shot was 1/5000th of a second. However, stopping action does not always result in the most realistic portrayal of a subject. Imagine a race car on a bank track, photographed at 1/8000th of a second. The car would appear to be stationary, the background would be tack sharp, and the wheels would appear to not be rotating. the car would look like it's parked on the track, not moving along at 200 miles an hour. So, some motion blur, both on the subject and even the background, can be effective in still photos, like this shot of mine of Juan Pablo Montoya, but motion blur can also come into play when shooting video. In the world of video, shutter speeds are treated a little differently than in still photography. In video, if your shutter speed is too fast, the video can look very herky-jerky and unnatural. This can get so bad that some people get motion sickness or vertigo when they're watching clips shot at high shutter speeds. Videographers sometimes employ high shutter speed as an artistic effect, but for the most part, they ascribe to something known as the 180-degree rule when selecting their shutter speed. What this rule says is, for the most cinematic, natural-looking video, you want your shutter speed to be the inverse of twice your frame rate. As a formula, it looks like this. So, for example, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, what would your shutter speed be? It's okay, I'll wait. Yep, that's right, 1/48th of a second. Well, not exactly. There is no 1/48th of a second shutter speed on the Osmo Pocket, or any other camera for that matter, so you just use 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting 4K video, let's say, at 60 frames per second, what do you think your shutter speed would be then? 1/120th of a second. That's right, good job. Now what about the last corner of the exposure triangle, ISO? Back in the day, the film equivalent of ISO was known as ASA, and every ASA represented a different formulation of film. Once you loaded a film canister with a given ASA, you really couldn't do anything to change it. You had to shoot the entire roll at that ASA. In today's digital cameras, ISO is like a volume knob for your sensor, controlling the amplification of the signal or exposure hitting your camera sensor. But like many things in the world of physics, you don't get something for nothing. The more you amplify the signal, the more noise you introduce into your photos and videos. Think of a stereo system with no audio source level, or a very low level. If you turn up the volume in order to hear the source, you're going to also hear a lot of hum, static, hiss, and other unwanted noise while you try to amplify the audio source. In a camera, the equivalent of audio signal is light. If you turn your ISO up to 11, even when there's a low level of light input, you're going to generate a lot of noise in your photos and videos. More expensive cameras have much better low light performance, so they can shoot at much higher ISOs, but the Osmo Pocket is a relatively inexpensive camera. Okay, so let's pull this all together as it relates to ND filters and the Osmo Pocket. Like we said before, the aperture of the Osmo Pocket is fixed as f2.0, and that's really large. You want to place your ISO as low as you can get it if you're shooting outdoors, because with that large aperture lens, you're going to have tons of light streaming onto the Osmo Pocket sensor. So you're going to want to keep the amplification or ISO level as low as possible. This would be 100. You will find, however, that in bright sunlight, even at ISO 100, your exposure values are going to be way higher than where the 180-degree rule tells you to be. In this example, I've set the Osmo Pocket to auto ISO mode and can see the exposure reading is f2.0, 1/50th of a second, and ISO 100, and the EV is showing 2.7. I then switched to manual mode with the ISO set to 100 and shutter speed at 1/50th of a second, and the Mimo app is telling me I am overexposed again by 2.7 stops. See the EV number at the bottom of the screen? It says +27. I would normally think I was going to need an ND filter to reduce the light by about 3 stops, but something didn't seem right when I saw these two numbers equaling each other. My photographer's instinct told me I should be at a lot more overexposed than this, so I pointed the Osmo Pocket straight up into the sky, and it still read +2.7. Uh-oh. I'm guessing that's as high as the light meter in the Osmo Pocket goes. I went inside and grabbed my light meter and took a reading outside, and here's what I got. At 24 frames a second, ISO 100, I got f25. Hold on there, Baba Louie. That's a lot more than 3 stops overexposed. That's more than 6 stops of ND filter needed. Okay, let's try shooting the Osmo Pocket in auto mode. I did this, and here's what I saw. ISO 100, f2.0 of course, and 1/1600th of a second. Doing the quick math, that's 5 stops of overexposure. This graphic shows how I got to 5 stops. By the way, this is the way I recommend that you figure out which ND filter you need. Shoot an auto, set the ISO at 100, and see what the shutter speed is. Then calculate the number of stops you need to adjust to get your shutter speed back to where the 180-degree rule says you should be. Then find the appropriate ND filter. Why the one-stop difference between my handheld light meter and what the Osmo Pocket said? It might be a couple of things. First of all, the handheld meter is very accurate, and the Osmo Pocket meter maybe not so much. Second of all, the handheld light meter is reading incident light, or the light falling on the subject, which is usually more accurate when calculating exposure. The meter in the camera, like all cameras, it's reading reflected light. I'll dive into more details on this in my upcoming exposure video. So, now that I know how many stops of light I need to get rid of, I'll just reach into my ND filter case and grab the filter marked 5 stops. Oh, if it were only that easy, my friends. Rather than label ND filters as 1 stop, 2 stops, red stops, blue stops, they label them things like ND4, ND8, ND16, ND32, ND64. Wait, what? Turns out, the number next to the ND represents the power of 2, that is the number of stops of light reduction you can expect from a filter. If you aren't sure what that means, here's a cheat sheet for you. Take a while and admire the elegance represented by factors of 2 and hearken back to high school algebra. Oh man, that hair. Well, it was the 70s. We all kind of looked like that. Alright, back to the present day. In our example, with the Mimo app telling us the scene is 5 stops overexposed, which ND filter would you choose? If you said the ND32, you'd be correct. ND32 represents a 5-stop reduction in exposure, and it's as best we can get to nailing the exposure at ISO 100 and f2.0. Alright, here's the cheat sheet again. See the number 5 in the middle column? I should mention right about now that there's another method of reducing the light hitting your sensor, and that's to reduce the size of the aperture. This is called stopping down, but you can't do this with the Osmo Pocket since the aperture is fixed at f2.0. I'll get into this in more detail in the upcoming video on exposure, depth of field, and something called the Sunny 16 rule. So now that we know which ND filter we need, we're going to take a look at the Freewell All Day 4K series set of ND and polarizer filters for the Osmo Pocket. This set comes with 8 filters listed here. The ND4, ND8, ND16, a circular polarizer, and 4 combination ND and polarizer filters, an ND8/PL, an ND16/PL, ND32/PL, and an ND64/PL. The filters are among the more expensive set of ND and polarizer filters on the market, and they claim to be made of optical glass with 16 layers of coatings, including anti-reflective, low glare, low distortion, waterproof coating, scratch-proof, and oil-proof coatings. The last one is to keep the oils from your fingers from permanently marring your filters. The filters are packed in a plastic case, and each has its own cutout location in the foam liner inside. The case itself is extremely difficult to open, which is something I've read in other reviews. I get that you want the thing to be secure, but come on! I can almost guarantee you're going to spill the little fellows all over the place at least once, so be sure to open them up somewhere it won't harm them to fall onto, and where they'll easily be found. Once open, you're forced with another challenge, actually reading the writing on the filters. I know these guys are small, and there's not a lot of room for the white lettering, but be prepared to be stumped, especially if your eyes aren't as young as they once were like mine. If the case was designed differently, I might think about adding labels above each filter with the name of the filter on it. But what I've actually done for now is just place them in order, from the ND4 all the way up to the ND64. The filters are held securely to the front lens of the Osmo Pocket with magnets. So let's go back to our scene from earlier, where we were overexposed by 5 stops. Here's the scene without the ND filter. I don't need to tell you this is not good. And here's the scene with the 5-stop ND32 filter in place. Looks better, huh? The Freewell filters appear to be high-quality glass, and I saw no distortion or vignetting in any of my test clips. Because they're so small, I'd suggest keeping a lens cloth with you, as they're going to get smudged when you pick them up and move them around. Also, swapping them out on a live Osmo Pocket will likely result in more than one gimbal error. What about the polarizing filter and the combination ND and polarizers? Well, we're all familiar with the concept of polarized sunglasses and other types of polarized glass. It's everywhere, from the glass on the dashboard of your car to the glass on many household appliances, electronics, and even most windshields. What polarizing filters do is to reduce the glare and unwanted reflections. The Freewell polarizing filters are what is known as circular polarizers, or CPLs. What this means is they can be rotated around 360 degrees to vary the amount of angle and polarization. On the Freewell filters, there is a ring of polarized glass and a white line on the outside of the ring and a matching white line on the body of the ND filter. And when the two white lines are lined up, you have the maximum amount of polarizing effect. I found the Freewell polarizing filters were puzzling. I tried for more than a half hour to get them to reduce glare or reflections and to improve the contrast in the midday sun, and the effects were very subtle at best. Here's how it looks before and after to get rid of reflections in a window. Not much difference, is there? I'm going to keep messing with these polarizers to see if maybe my inability to get them to work is pilot error on my part, and I'll issue an update if I figure it out. My conclusion: the Freewell ND filters are absolutely worth the money and are highly recommended. I could live without the circular polarizers though, but in the case of this kit, you get them with some of the ND filters anyway, and with the ND32 and ND64, you have no choice. They're only available with the polarizer. I hope you enjoyed this review of the Freewell ND filter and our brief visit to the world of exposure. As I mentioned, I'll expand on this topic in a future episode. If you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up button, and if you want to subscribe to my videos so you'll be informed of all the upcoming ones, hit the subscribe button over there or below. I've got a number of interesting videos in the queue, so why not subscribe? It's free. In addition, I've included links to all the products in this video in the description below, so if you'd like more information, click on the appropriate link, and if you want to buy, go right ahead. Thanks for watching. I'm Dennis, and this has been Picks to Flicks.